My name is Blake, and I'm 28 years old. If you're reading this, then you probably already know that stories like mine don't just happen overnight. My struggles didn't begin suddenly, like a switch being flipped. They simmered, grew, and festered over years, over decades, until they became the tangled mess I'm left with today. When I was a kid, people would say I was difficult, though they didn't really understand what that meant. I've been living with ADHD for as long as I can remember. Back then, the adults in my life didn't seem to know what to do with me. I was impulsive, loud, restless, too much for a lot of people. My parents didn't hit me, didn't scream at me, but they also didn't know how to help me. Instead, they decided to protect me. To them, protecting meant excusing my behavior. If I couldn't sit still, they'd tell the teacher, "Blake can't help it, he's special." If I acted out, they'd explain it away with, "He's just overwhelmed. You have to be patient with him." I didn't understand it back then, but that patience was a double-edged sword. It sheltered me from consequences, sure, but it also taught me that I could do whatever I wanted, that I didn't need to take responsibility. Then came Ethan, my little brother. He was born when I was 5 years old, and it felt like my world flipped upside down. You know how people say a new sibling brings joy and excitement? That wasn't my experience. From the moment he arrived, Ethan became the golden child. Perfect in every way I wasn't. He was calm, quiet, and obedient. If I was a hurricane, it would be a clear summer day, and everyone loved him for it. At first, I didn't hate him. I was just a kid, and I didn't even understand what jealousy was. But over time, I started noticing the way my parents looked at him compared to me. They'd smile when he sat still through dinner, while they'd sigh at my constant fidgeting. They'd beam with pride when he brought home a star on his homework, while my school reports were always met with disappointment. The comparisons weren't always spoken out loud, but I felt them every single day. I remember my mom once saying, "Ethan, you're such a good boy," while shooting me a glance that said the opposite. It wasn't even the words. It was the tone, the kind of tone that makes you feel small, like you're never going to measure up. I started to resent Ethan, not because of anything he did, but because he was everything I couldn't be. That resentment twisted inside me until it turned into something darker. I began lashing out. At first, it was little things. Stealing his toys, knocking over his Lego towers, making him cry just because I could. I remember seeing the hurt on his face and feeling satisfied. It wasn't because I hated him. It was because, for once, I felt like I had power. If I couldn't be the one they were proud of, I'd be the one they had to notice. My parents never punished me. Never really stopped me. Instead, they'd turn to Ethan and say things like, "You need to be patient with Blake. He doesn't mean it." But I did mean it. I was angry. Angry at my parents for ignoring me. Angry at Ethan for being perfect. And angry at myself for being broken in a way I couldn't fix. Looking back, I know now that my parents' patience was really just avoidance. They didn't want to admit that I was a problem they couldn't solve. So they kept making excuses for me instead. They thought they were helping, but all they did was push Ethan further away and trap me in this spiral of anger and entitlement. I didn't know how to take accountability for my actions because I was never taught to. The older Ethan got, the worse things became. He started standing out more and more, top grades, praise from teachers, friends who actually liked him. Watching him succeed felt like a slap to the face every time. I should have been happy for him. He was my brother after all, but all I felt was rage. Why couldn't I be like him? Why couldn't I get even a fraction of the respect and admiration he seemed to earn so effortlessly? It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was bitterness. And instead of trying to deal with it, I made it worse. I'd ruin his school projects, make fun of him when he brought friends over, and throw tantrums anytime he was the center of attention. I told myself it was his fault, that if he weren't so perfect, I wouldn't feel so worthless. The truth is, I wasn't angry at Ethan. Not really. I was angry at my parents. They were the ones who should have stepped in. They were the ones who let me treat him that way. Every time they turned a blind eye to my behavior, it just reinforced what I already knew. Ethan mattered more than I did. He deserved their love. I didn't. I started acting out in other ways too. Picking fights at school, ignoring my homework, refusing to follow rules. I thought maybe if I was bad enough, they'd finally pay attention to me. But instead of facing the problem, they just coddled me more. "Blake's having a hard time. they'd tell my teachers. He's just struggling right now. I started to feel like I was drowning, trapped in a cycle of anger, guilt, and frustration that I didn't know how to escape. And Ethan? He learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. He stopped trying to fight back or ask for help because he knew our parents wouldn't listen. I could see it in his eyes. He hated me, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. As the years went on, our family dynamic solidified into something toxic and unspoken. I was the problem child, and Ethan was the golden boy. My parents, whether they realized it or not, played into those roles. They weren't bad people. They were just blind to what was happening right in front of them. But the damage was done. I was angry and lost, and Ethan was quietly building a plan to escape. I didn't know it then, but the day he left would be the day everything started to fall apart. By the time I turned 16, the resentment I carried had taken root in every part of my life. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was everything. My parents' favoritism, their refusal to hold me accountable, and the way I was treated like I could do no wrong while Ethan was expected to be the understanding one. I didn't have the words for it then, but looking back, I realized that I was angry at myself too. Angry because I felt so powerless, so lost, and unable to be the person everyone else wanted me to be. Ethan was 15, and by then, he had learned to adapt. He avoided me whenever he could, staying out of my way like a ghost in his own home. I can't remember the last time we'd spoken without my voice raised or without me pushing his buttons just to get a reaction. The truth? I wanted him to hate me. It was easier to deal with his anger than his silence. I think I needed to feel like he acknowledged me, even if it was in the worst way. But while Ethan got quieter, my behavior got worse. I stopped trying in school completely. Teachers would send notes home about my poor grades, about my refusal to participate or listen, but my parents shrugged it off. "He's just overwhelmed," they'd say. Or my favorite excuse, "He'll grow out of it." I hated school because it reminded me of everything I couldn't be. Smart, successful, praised. My ADHD made focusing on anything a challenge, but instead of learning to manage it, I leaned into the chaos. Acting out was easier than failing. Then there was Ethan, making honor roll, winning awards, and getting invited to every teacher's favorite student event. If I heard, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" one more time, I think I might have exploded. It wasn't just from teachers either. Family gatherings were worse. My aunts and uncles would praise Ethan for being so polite, so well-mannered, so promising. Meanwhile, I'd get a few pats on the back and uncomfortable questions like, "So Blake, what's your plan for the future?" What plan? I didn't have one. How could I? I had spent my entire life being coddled and shielded from consequences. No one had ever taught me how to build a future or even how to believe in myself enough to try. I felt like I was already too far gone. Things reached a boiling point the summer before Ethan turned 18. By then, I'd developed a nasty habit of pushing boundaries just to see what I could get away with, breaking things when I was angry, lashing out at my parents when they tried to tell me what to do. And Ethan? He became my favorite target. I don't even know why I did it most of the time. I'd walk past his room and knock over his schoolwork, or I'd accidentally break something he valued. I still remember the day I smashed his project for the state science fair. It was this model of a solar system he'd spent weeks building. Perfect, precise, and impressive. He was so proud of it, and for reasons I couldn't explain, that pride set something off in me. While he was out running errands with Mom, I walked into his room, picked up the project, and hurled it to the ground. It shattered into pieces, the foam planets rolling under his desk and bed like they were trying to escape. When Ethan came home and saw what I'd done, the look on his face stopped me cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was a resignation, like he had already expected it, like he had stopped hoping for better. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just walked past me and told Mom what happened. And do you know what she did? Nothing. She patted his shoulder and said, "It's okay, sweetie. Your brother didn't mean it." I'll never forget the way Ethan looked at me in that moment, his expression both empty and sharp. That was the day I realized he was planning to leave. I could see it in his eyes. He was done. Done with me. Done with them. Done with all of it. I was right. Months later, Ethan announced that he'd been accepted to a university across the country. He brought it up at dinner, almost casually, like he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to drop the bomb. Mom's fork clattered onto her plate, and Dad's face turned to stone. "What do you mean across the country?" my dad demanded, his voice sharp. "I mean I'm leaving," Ethan replied calmly, cutting his steak like this was a normal conversation. "I've already made up my mind." I didn't say anything. I just sat there, gripping my fork so hard my knuckles turned white. I felt something crack inside me. Mom tried guilt-tripping him. "But honey, why do you need to go so far away? There are great schools here. You don't need to leave your family behind." Ethan didn't even look up. "I want to experience something different." That's when Dad turned to me, his voice full of frustration. "Blake needs you here. You know how hard things are for him. You can't just abandon him like that." I don't know if my parents realized it, but that comment sent a clear message. I was a burden. Even then, I still didn't deserve to be more than an afterthought in Ethan's life. I wasn't even surprised when Ethan said what he did next. "I'm not responsible for Blake," he said quietly. Those words hit me harder than I expected. Ethan didn't look angry when he said it. He just looked tired, like he'd carried the weight of my problems for so long that he had nothing left to give. My parents argued with him all night, begging him to reconsider. I sat there in silence, barely hearing the conversation. All I could think about was how much I hated him for leaving me. How dare he walk away? How dare he get to live his life while I was stuck here, spinning in circles with no way out? The next morning, I found Ethan in the garage packing boxes into the back of his car. I wanted to say something, anything to stop him, to tell him I was sorry, to tell him I needed him. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. I just stood there watching as he loaded up his things, closed the trunk, and drove away without looking back. For the first time in my life, I felt empty, like the one constant in my chaotic world had been ripped away. And deep down, I knew it was my fault. I had pushed him too far, too hard, for too long. After Ethan drove away, it was like the house lost its center of gravity. Things weren't quieter. If anything, they were worse. My parents walked around like shadows of themselves, barely talking to me or each other. Without Ethan to absorb all their attention, I think they finally started noticing me for what I really was, a problem they didn't know how to fix. At first, I tried to act like I didn't care. I told myself, good riddance. Ethan was selfish for leaving, and I didn't need him anyway. But that wasn't true. The emptiness he left behind was louder than anything I'd ever heard. For years, Ethan had been my outlet, my scapegoat. Now that he was gone, all I had was my own frustration staring me in the face. The first few weeks were the hardest. Mom would hover in doorways, watching me like she didn't recognize me anymore. Dad buried himself in work, staying late at the job site so he didn't have to deal with what was happening at home. No one said Ethan's name, but we all felt his absence like a gaping hole that couldn't be ignored. I'd sit in the living room with the TV blasting to drown out the silence. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing at the stairs, half expecting him to come walking down like nothing had changed, but he never did. Without Ethan, I fell into a spiral. I stopped caring about everything. School, my future, myself. My days blurred together in a cycle of sleeping late, eating whatever I could find, and killing time on video games or my phone. My grades, already hanging by a thread, fell off a cliff. Teachers would try to call my parents, but my mom would wave it off, saying I just needed more time to adjust. Adjust to what? The fact that my life was an aimless mess and no one was coming to save me? I started acting out in worse ways, almost testing how far I could push things. At night, I'd sneak out of the house and wander around the neighborhood just to feel something different. I'd kick over trash cans, throw rocks at empty buildings, and generally do anything reckless enough to make me forget how stuck I felt. I never got caught, but part of me wanted to. At least then someone would finally look at me and see that something was wrong. My parents didn't ask where I was going or what I was doing. Maybe they didn't want to know. I could see it in their eyes whenever we crossed paths in the kitchen or the hallway. Guilt. Guilt for how they'd raised me. Guilt for not holding me accountable sooner. Guilt for driving Ethan away. But by then it was too late. They'd let me run wild for so long that trying to reel me back in felt impossible. I didn't make it easy for them either. One night, after a particularly bad day at school, I came home to find Mom sitting at the dining table with tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what had happened, but I didn't care enough to ask. I just grabbed a soda from the fridge and started heading upstairs. "Blake," she said softly, her voice cracking. "What?" I muttered, not even turning around. Please, can we talk? Something about the way she said it hit a nerve. I whipped around and stared at her. Talk about what, Ethan? Or how I'm such a screw-up? Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw her flinch like I'd hit her. You're not a screw-up, Blake. We don't know how to help you. Help me? I laughed bitterly. You haven't been helping me my whole life. You've just been ignoring me or making excuses. You think I wanted to be like this? You think I wanted to be the broken one while Ethan got to be perfect? Mom didn't say anything. She just looked down at her hands, shaking. I turned and stormed upstairs, slamming the door so hard that the walls rattled. I don't know if she cried more after that, but I didn't care. I was too busy feeling sorry for myself to think about how my words might have hurt her. That was the first time I really said it out loud, that I hated myself for being the way I was, but instead of dealing with those feelings, I let the anger fester. Years passed like that. By the time I was 20, I was still living at home, going nowhere fast. I dropped out of high school after barely scraping through my junior year. I got a part-time job at a gas station, but I quit after a month because the manager told me I had a bad attitude. I blamed him, of course, but deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't know how to handle authority or responsibility. My parents tried to push me into getting my GED, but I refused. Every time they brought it up, it turned into a screaming match. I'd shout that it was their fault I'd ended up like this, that they were the ones who had coddled me and let me believe I didn't need to try. They'd shout back that I needed to take responsibility for my own life. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent years making excuses for me, and now they expected me to magically grow up overnight. The worst part was that I started to believe them. Maybe I really was useless. Maybe there was no fixing me. I'd see kids my age on social media, graduating from college, starting careers, traveling the world, and I'd feel this deep, gnawing pit of shame. I hated them for having what I didn't, but more than that, I hated myself for not even trying. Sometimes I wondered if Ethan thought about me. We hadn't spoken since he left. I didn't have his number and he never reached out. I'd hear bits and pieces about him through my grandparents, how he was doing well in school, how he'd landed a good job, how proud they were of him. Hearing those updates always sent me into a spiral. I'd spend days holed up in my room, staring at the ceiling and wondering how two people from the same family could end up so different. Ethan was thriving while I was drowning, and no one seemed surprised by it. Everything came crashing down when I was 22. I'd spent the day aimlessly wandering around town, killing time, when I spotted a group of neighborhood kids playing outside. They were laughing, chasing each other with water balloons, and for some reason, it set me off. Their joy felt like a slap in the face. Without thinking, I walked over, grabbed a bucket of water they'd left nearby, and dumped it all over one of the kids. He started crying immediately, and the others scattered. I just stood there, breathing heavily, as the reality of what I'd done sank in. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't even know why I did it. But it didn't matter. One of the parents came storming out of the house, yelling at me, and before I knew it, they were calling the police. When the officers arrived, I didn't fight them. I just let them cuff me and take me away. I think part of me was relieved. Finally, someone was forcing me to face the consequences of my actions. My parents had to bail me out later that night. I expected them to yell, to lecture me, to be furious. But when Dad picked me up from the station, he didn't say a word. He just stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When we got home, he turned to me and said quietly, "We can't keep doing this, Blake. We can't fix you." I didn't know what to say. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. After that night, things in the house shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. My parents stopped trying. They didn't nag me to get a job or finish school anymore. They just existed alongside me like we were strangers sharing the same roof. Meals were eaten in silence. The TV would hum quietly in the background, filling the emptiness with noise that none of us paid attention to. At first, I thought I preferred it this way. No one expected anything from me anymore. No one tried to push me to be better. But the truth was, their indifference cut deeper than their shouting ever had. It was like they'd given up on me, like I was a lost cause they didn't know how to deal with anymore. I'd always craved attention, even if it was negative, and now that I had nothing, I felt invisible. Without my parents' constant pressure, the days melted together. I'd sleep until the sun was high in the sky, eat whatever junk food was in the house, and waste hours online or staring at the ceiling of my room. I'd think about my life, what I could have been if I hadn't screwed everything up. But those thoughts never led anywhere good. They just made me feel smaller. I don't know how long I would have stayed like that if it weren't for the call from my grandparents. It happened on a random Tuesday. I just rolled out of bed when my mom knocked on my door, holding the phone out with a grim expression. "It's Grandpa. He wants to talk to you." I hesitated. I loved my grandparents, but they'd never called me directly before. I took the phone and brought it up to my ear. "Hello? Blake." Grandpa's voice crackled through the line, steady but sharp. "It's been a while." "Yeah," I muttered, unsure of what else to say. There was a pause. Then he sighed. "You're wasting your life, kid." The words hit like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I snapped, immediately defensive. "You know what I'm talking about," he said firmly. "Your parents told me about what happened with the neighbors, about the police." I gritted my teeth, my free hand clenching at my side. "They had no right to—" "They're worried about you, Blake, and so am I. You can't keep living like this." I wanted to hang up, to tell him he didn't understand, but part of me knew he was right. Instead, I stayed silent, staring at the floor while he continued. "I've watched you grow up," he said softly, "and I know life hasn't been fair to you. But at some point, you have to stop blaming the world for your problems and start fixing them yourself. You're not a kid anymore." "Easy for you to say," I muttered. "You don't know what it's like." "I know more than you think," he shot back, his voice sharp again. "Your dad wasn't perfect either, you know, but he worked hard to give you a better life than he had. And now you're throwing it away because you're too angry to see what's in front of you." I didn't know how to respond. My grandfather wasn't one for emotional speeches, so hearing this from him felt heavier than anything my parents had ever said. He let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. "You need to find something to hold on to, Blake. A purpose. Because if you don't, you're going to wake up one day and realize you've wasted everything." I mumbled a goodbye and handed the phone back to my mom without another word. She gave me a wary look, but I ignored it and went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, replaying Grandpa's words over and over. As much as I didn't want to admit it, the call shook me. I started looking around at my life and seeing it for what it was, a mess. My room was trashed, clothes and empty food wrappers everywhere. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I'd become the exact person I used to mock when I was younger, a burnout with no ambition, no goals, and no future. But instead of making changes, I fell deeper into my anger. I told myself that it wasn't my fault. It was my parents for enabling me, Ethan for abandoning me, and the world for not understanding me. I spent my days in a fog, spiraling further into self-loathing, but still too stubborn to ask for help. Then came the breaking point. It was late at night, and I was walking around the neighborhood, something I did when the walls of the house felt like they were suffocating me. As I passed by a row of houses, I saw a family through their living room window. The parents were sitting on the couch while two kids, probably close in age to Ethan and me when we were young, played with toy cars on the floor. The sight stopped me in my tracks. It was so normal, so simple, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought about how my life had started out the same way. My parents probably had hopes and dreams for me, just like that family did for their kids. But somewhere along the line, I'd gone off course, and no one knew how to fix it, not even me. I stood there for a long time, watching that family until I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and walked home, tears burning in my eyes. I hated myself for feeling so weak, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I searched for Ethan online. I didn't have his number or his email, but after scrolling through a few social media accounts, I found him. He looked different, older, happier, and successful. There were pictures of him with friends, at his job, even traveling to places I'd never seen. He looked like everything I wasn't, and for the first time in years, I felt ashamed. I sat there staring at his profile for what felt like hours, debating whether to reach out. What would I even say? "I'm sorry, I miss you?" Would he even care? Probably not. He'd made it clear when he left that he didn't owe me anything, and after everything I'd put him through, he was right. But I couldn't help myself. I typed out a short message. "Hey Ethan, it's Blake. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I'm sorry." I hope you're doing okay. I hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity before finally clicking it. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply that might never come. Days passed without a response, and each hour that went by felt like another weight added to my chest. I tried to tell myself that I didn't care, that I shouldn't have expected anything, but it still hurt. I spent hours thinking about all the times I'd pushed him away, all the times I'd made his life harder because I couldn't deal with my own anger. It was my fault, all of it. For the first time, I started to see the truth that I'd been avoiding for years. My parents weren't to blame for everything. Ethan wasn't the enemy. The problem was me, my choices, my actions, my refusal to change. It was easier to blame everyone else than to admit that I was the reason my life had turned out like this. I didn't know how to fix it. I still don't. But for the first time, I realized that I wanted to try. I sat there on the floor of my room, surrounded by the mess of my life, realizing that I was finally out of excuses. For years, I'd blamed Ethan, my parents, my ADHD, anything and anyone but myself. But now, there was no one left to blame. I was tired of being angry, tired of being this version of me. That night, after hours of pacing, I walked downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee in silence, the lines on her face deeper than I remembered. I sat down at the table across from her. She looked up, startled, like she was waiting for me to ask for something or start another argument. Instead, I said softly, "I need help." At first, she didn't say anything. Her eyes searched mine, trying to figure out if I was serious. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. I don't want to keep living like this. I can't." For the first time in years, my mom cried in front of me. She reached across the table, taking my hand like she was holding on for dear life. "We'll figure it out, Blake. I promise." Those words felt like a small light breaking through the darkness. 2 days later, I walked into a therapist's office. I didn't want to be there. Sitting in that sterile room, surrounded by books and tissues, I felt exposed, like every broken part of me was on display. "Why do you think you acted out against your brother?" the therapist asked after a long silence. I shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know. I guess I hated him." "Did you really hate him? Or did you hate yourself for not being like him?" I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I started to admit the truth. I wasn't angry at Ethan. I was angry at myself for not being good enough, for not being able to control my emotions, for always disappointing everyone. Hurting him had been a way to vent my own frustration, to make someone else feel as miserable as I did. I left the office that day feeling raw and exposed. Therapy didn't fix me overnight, but it forced me to start looking at myself, really looking. It was hard, harder than I thought it would be. As I slowly tried to piece myself together, the weight of what I'd done to Ethan haunted me. I didn't expect him to forgive me. After all, what had I ever done to deserve it? But I knew I had to try. I sent him a message. Simple, honest, and true. "Ethan, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm sorry. I hurt you, and I'm starting to understand how much damage I caused. I hope you're doing okay. I'm trying to change." I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, waiting for a reply I was sure would never come. But that night, my phone buzzed. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I hope you're serious about changing." I reread his message a dozen times. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope. And hope was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, therapy forced my family to face their own truths. My parents, who had spent years enabling my behavior, started to see the damage they'd caused, not just to Ethan, but to me as well. "We thought we were protecting you," my mom admitted during one session, tears in her eyes. "But we were just running away from the problem." My dad, quiet and ashamed, added, "We should have done better, Blake, for you and for Ethan." Hearing them take responsibility didn't erase the past, but it helped. For the first time, we were all trying. We couldn't change what had happened, but we could start doing better. Over the next few weeks, I made small changes. I got a part-time job at a local store. I cleaned up my room, sorting through years of junk I'd hoarded like a shield against the world. It felt symbolic, like I was finally clearing out the parts of myself that no longer fit. One evening, as I sat on my bed after work, I got another message from Ethan. "I hope you're okay, Blake." It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that maybe, just maybe, I could fix the pieces I'd broken. Months passed, and I kept going to therapy, forcing myself to confront the truth of who I'd been and what I'd done. It wasn't easy. Some days I sat in silence, unable to say anything. Other days I couldn't stop crying, overwhelmed by guilt and regret. My parents tried to change too. My mom stopped making excuses for me and started holding me accountable. My dad, always the stoic one, admitted that he'd failed us both, me and Ethan, by avoiding the hard truths for so long. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One day, after a particularly hard session, I found myself staring at Ethan's name on my phone. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, but his last message stayed with me. "I hope you're okay." It was the first time in years anyone had said those words to me without anger or pity. I decided to send him a follow-up. "I'm working on myself, Ethan. I know I have a long way to go, but I want you to know I'm serious. I hope one day you can see that." Hours later, a simple reply came. "Keep going, Blake." I sat there, phone in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It wasn't forgiveness, and I didn't deserve that yet, but it was a door left slightly open. I knew better than to rush through it. I started writing letters to Ethan. Letters I wasn't ready to send yet. I told him the things I couldn't say in person, how I envied him, how I blamed him for things that were never his fault, how I hated myself for making him feel like he wasn't safe in his own home. The truth was, I never hated Ethan. I hated the parts of myself I couldn't control, the expectations I couldn't meet, and the loneliness I didn't know how to escape. I poured it all into those letters, trying to let go of the bitterness I'd carried for so long. Now I'm working towards something better. I have a steady job, I'm learning to manage my ADHD, and I'm trying to rebuild the trust I destroyed. It's slow, painfully slow, but I'm learning that change isn't about fixing everything at once. It's about showing up every day, ready to try again. I don't know if Ethan will ever forgive me, but I hope he knows that I'm not the same person I used to be. I hope someday I'll get to tell him that in person. For now, I'll keep going, because for the first time in my life, I believe I can, and that's enough.